Thank you. Yeah, so as I said, I'm Ben, and I work for a company called Open Data Services Cooperative. I'm going to tell you a bit about what we do. So our aim is in big letters on our website. We help people use and publish open data, and we're particularly interested in stuff around standardizing open data and doing work that has a social impact. So to start exploring sort of what we mean by that, I'm going to start off by saying what open data is. So first of all, the data bit, we're talking about easily machine readable data rather than say something on paper or scanned PDFs or needing to scrape web pages. And when we say open, we're talking about the same open as in open source. So it's more than just data that's public or shared. It's also data that is licensed in a way that lets people use it, modify it, and share it for any purpose. And much like with open source, there can be some conditions around attribution and share alike. So these are some of the most common open data licenses, and I think the most popular ones are probably the Creative Commons licenses, because they're well known from licensing content, and the latest versions of those licenses cover both copyright and database rights. So one way to consider open data is it's on this spectrum of data openness. So one end you've got closed data that shouldn't be shared at all. In the middle you've got data that's maybe shared, but there should be limitations on who should have access to it. And then you've got data that's should be open data because it's useful for the public good. So what's some of the open data that we actually work with? So we work with some data about contracting and public procurement, some data around international aid and charitable grants, beneficial ownership data, so who ultimately owns and controls companies, and we work with a registration of prefixes for organisation identifiers, which makes it possible to construct globally unique organisation identifiers. Then for each of these different kinds of open data that we're working with, there's an open data standard. So a little bit about what we mean by open data standard. So a data standard is something where you've got a machine and human readable agreement about how you're going to format and structure some data. And then a standard is open if it's openly licensed, but also if the decision-making process is open and transparent and seeks broad consensus. And a good open data standard will build on and align with other standards. So data standards make data comparable and combinable. So here's a dummy example of two data sets that are very hard to compare because the headings are completely different and numbers are formatted in all sorts of different ways. And here's an example of that same data formatted to the same standard, and you can see that it's much easier for us to compare, and it would be much easier for a computer to compare as well. So data standards allow data exchange between systems, aggregation of data without needing to write custom converters for each data source, and building and sharing tooling that works with the data that conforms to that data standard. So at Open Data Services, we want our work around open data standards to have social impact as well as being technically useful. And generally this means working with an advocacy organisation in the area we're talking about. So for example, with the contracting data, we work with Open Contracting Partnership, a global NGO who advocate for more inclusive and transparent contracting and procurement processes. And part of that is advocating for more data publication. And then a part of that is about standardizing data. And that's the piece that we work on with them. And so in this advocacy context, in addition to describing how data should be published, data standards are also used as a tool to advocate for publication of more data, because you can point to the standard and say this is exactly in detailed data we think should be published. To allow organisations who want to publish data to make specific commitments about what kinds of data they're going to publish, and to act as a benchmark so that we can measure how good an organisation's data publication is. So this is just a slide with the different kinds of data I was talking about and some of the different organisations we work with on that. So I'm going to move on to the tech we work with for our work on open data standards. So we've got Json Schema. We've got a bunch of our own Python code we've written, which is open source on GitHub. We use Sphinx for documentation, Jupyter Notebooks for data analysis, and we use Elasticsearch and Postgres. And Postgres, so both of those we use to load larger amounts of data in from multiple sources and to be able to search and analyze it. And Postgres now has JSON support, which means we can load arbitrary JSON data in without needing to conform to a SQL schema. And we use JSONB, which means it's binary data under the hood, so it's still fast for searching and indexing. But going back to that top of that list, most of the data standards we work with describe how to publish JSON data. So, quick show of hands, who's heard of JSON before? Yeah. And who's used JSON for something? Yeah. So yeah, I had an example here for. So anyone who hasn't doesn't know what JSON is. Okay. So I had a quick description just in case, and we describe what our JSON data should look like using a JSON schema. So hands up again. Who's heard of JSON schema? It's less, but still quite a few people. And who's actually used it for something? Yeah, so that's slightly less people. But yeah, so here's an example of some JSON data on the left and some JSON schema describing it on the right. So this is some example data, but it's some real JSON schema from the Open Contracting Data Standard. You might be able to spot that the JSON schema is itself a JSON document, and there is a JSON schema that will tell you what that should look like. But yeah, so this particular bit of JSON schema describes this status field. So we've got a human readable title and description to tell people what should go in there, and we've got what types are allowed, and an enum saying what different values are allowed. And those different status values are based on research done on real governments, and even though there's some nuanced differences between how countries do this process, these codes fit close enough to be useful. And if a government does something sufficiently differently, there's a version process to make new versions of the standard with new codes in. So one of the big useful things about Json Schema is that it's machine readable, and so we can do validation of data against the schema. And there's libraries in lots of different programming languages to let us do this, but a lot of the data publishers we work with don't have the know-how to be using libraries or command line tools themselves. So we built a web-based validation tool, which, because we work in Python, uses the Python Json Schema library and replaces some of the errors with more useful and specific bits of information for the particular context we're working with. And we pull in those descriptions from the schema to tell people what the schema says should be in that field. Next, to document these standards, we use the Sphinx documentation tool, and this works quite well for us because it's a static site generator, which makes hosting easier. It uses plain text files with some markup, but that means we can put it in Git, version control it, and put it on GitHub, have pull requests easily. Sphinx's internationalization support is good, which is important for some of our standards, and it's written in Python, which is useful for us because it installs like the rest of our Python dependencies. We can extend it in Python, so we've got custom code to handle JSON schema files. So in the open data world, there's a bit of a battle between JSON and CSV because they're both sort of in the same niche. They're sort of plain text formats that are fairly simple and at least somewhat machine readable. And JSON is better defined but difficult for some users to work with. And it can also describe nested data, whereas CSV is easier for some users because they can use a spreadsheet, but there's trouble with how it's defined and stuff like encoding. And so to try and get the best of both worlds, we have JSON as the core format of our data standards and some tooling to do JSON to spreadsheet conversion. And our web-based validation tool will do that same conversion, keep a source map essentially, and then report where in the original spreadsheet a JSON validation error came from. Yeah, so next I wanted to give a couple examples of the impact that organisations we work with are having. So first of all, a case study from IATI, which is about age transparency data. So this is about the amount of aid money organisations have committed to spend in Madagascar, and the red line shows how much money is explained by Madagascar's internal systems, So this is data that's come from asking donors directly what they're doing in Madagascar, whereas the blue line is data that's come from these donors doing a open data publication of all of their data and then just aggregating that data and just looking at the stuff from Madagascar. And you can see that the open data is now describing a much larger amount of money being spent than the internal systems were. And this means that the Madagascan government can better know where money is being spent to coordinate its own domestic resources to be most efficiently used. And in addition to the financial data, the IATI data has got contact information in, so they can go, so the Madagascan government can go talk to people that they didn't previously know were there. And finally, their internal systems have some extra data they pull in, and so they're now pulling the IATI open data into those systems so that they can have the best of both worlds. Next, for a story from Open Contracting. So this is a picture of some Colombian school children with their school meals, and the meals are fairly basic, but they're there for a fair price thanks to Open Contracting. So Colombia has a lot of problems with school meals, stuff like overpriced ingredients, meals never getting to the recipients. Often the contracting process is difficult or corrupt enough that only the incumbent is likely to win, so you don't have a lot of competition. So Colombian central government worked with the city of Bogota to try and reform their procurement process for school meals. So they reworked their rather large contracts into much smaller ones and sort of splitting different stuff like purchasing food from stuff like meal preparation, so that it's more accessible for smaller companies. And they publish these tender documents openly via an easy-to-use virtual shop that people could bid on. So was a $140 million market. It was previously just 12 companies. Is now spent among 55 more specialised ones, and savings are estimated at about 15%, but the sort of quality of food and service delivery is much better as well. So how does the Open Contracting Data Standard come into this? It's meant that the city can compare like-for-like data between the previous system they were using and their new one, and it will also make it easier if they want to do comparisons to similar procurements elsewhere. Secondly, if the government needs any help analysing their data, they can call on a global community of experts in this data standard, and the Open Contracting Partnership themselves can more easily advise on the quality of the data and tell them what they should be doing to make it better. And if anything's sort of deliberately missing from the data, it will be a lot easier to spot. And finally, I wanted to say a little bit about the organisation I work for. So we're a worker cooperative, which means we're owned and democratically controlled by the workers. So it's a company of 16 employees, and we all work remotely, but most of us are UK based. And out of those 16, 13 of us are members of the cooperative, and all members are directors of the company, which is different from some co-ops who elect a board of directors. To run the business, we have a weekly meeting online and a quarterly meeting in person, and all employees are invited to those. And legally, decisions about how to run the business are made one member, one vote, but we try very hard to gather consensus first. Then we have a bunch of different subgroups who work on specific areas like finance, who then report to these meetings. And then of the company, only 6 of us are doing software development, so we have our own weekly call to discuss upcoming work, plan what sprints are coming up, and then for a given sprint we'll have someone who's our main contact with the client who will collect requirements and keep them updated on progress. So that's everything.
Thank you. So we have some time for questions. If you have any questions, let me know, because I will pass you this microphone so we can record as well your voice better from now on. It's not microphone.
Oh,
for recording.
Yes. Have you looked at any open data in Japan? I'm just curious if you think it's the same quality as data in other countries, or if there's anything that should be improved.
Yeah. So. We don't do any work in Japan, so I've not gone looking for work. I have sort of gone looking out of my own interest, and there's some open data portals, but my Japanese is not amazing, so that's sort of a barrier to me being able to assess it particularly well. I think I did quite a while ago do some work with converting some spreadsheets into some spreadsheets from JICA, the Japanese International Cooperation Agency, into the standard for the open aid data, IATI, and yeah, their data for that wasn't amazing, but I think. But it was, I don't know, it's also in a context where actually I don't know if it's changed, but at the time I think they were the only Asian donor publishing.
I have a question. Do you actually publish the data you work on through an API as well for your clients, or does it stay in a database?
A lot of the data we work with, we're encouraging other people to build their own APIs onto the data. So with but we don't do a lot of that ourselves. So we've got some stuff like with the charitable data. We've got a website that's powered by that with Elasticsearch behind it, and you can make queries to that to get JSON back, but it's not really been designed for broader use. And around the international aid data, There's another company that works on that has an API that aggregates all the data and presents that back. So yeah, it's not something we do so much of ourselves.
I was wondering about the companies and organisations you work with. Are they already open to being more open, or is it, is it quite self-selecting, or do you approach people and ask them if they want to become more transparent and open with their data?
Yeah, so we're sort of very often we're a step removed in terms of we're sort of one step removed from some of the people we're helping to publish, in that we're working via an organisation that has a remit around openness. So like all these organisations are very, very much about openness. It's sort of at the core of what they do, but they're not the people we're trying to help publish. And there's been sort of several avenues for trying to advocate for people to publish data. So for governments, there's the more general idea of open government, of which open data is a part, and there's a process called the Open Government Partnership. So a lot of governments have made much more general commitments about openness through the Open Government Partnership, and then stuff like open contracting has been brought to that arena as here's a more specific commitment you can make, and so I think that's where that's one place where a lot of buyings happen. I think for age transparency, it's been a big part of the aid effectiveness agenda, which again is something that a lot of governments have sort of bought into this more general thing about aid effectiveness, and publishing open data has been sort of brought up as part of that.
Might we take one last question if there's any? Nope. Okay. Thank you very much, Ben.